Millionaire laughed when Janitor's son said he was the new boss, his biggest mistake. Richard Morrison was in the middle of a crucial meeting with international investors when his secretary tried to stop someone from entering the room. The 5 executives accompanying him stopped talking when they saw a boy of about 12 wearing a blue hooded jacket and carrying a school backpack on his shoulders. It was then that the boy lifted his chin and declared with a firmness that surprised everyone present, "Mr. Richard, you can stop this meeting. I am the new owner of this company." The room erupted in laughter. Richard rose from his chair, still laughing, and gestured to the other men as if watching the greatest comedy show of their lives. The foreign investors seemed confused, but soon began to laugh too, thinking it was part of some crazy American tradition. "Kid, who do you think you are?" Richard asked, wiping a tear from laughing so hard. "How did you get in here? Where is security?" The boy was not intimidated. His expression remained serious as he opened the backpack and took out a yellow envelope, the kind used for important documents. With careful movements, he placed the envelope on the meeting table right in front of Richard. "My name is Nathan Silver Morrison, and these documents prove that you stole this company from my grandfather." Richard's smile vanished, as if someone had thrown cold water on his face. He looked at the envelope, then at the boy, trying to understand if this was some kind of tasteless joke. The executives stopped laughing, and a heavy silence filled the room. "This is ridiculous," Richard murmured, but his voice no longer had its former confidence. "Nathan who? What is this story about a grandfather?" The boy took a deep breath before answering, as if preparing for a battle he knew would be difficult. "My grandfather was William Silver. He was your founding partner in this company 30 years ago. You tricked him when he was sick and could no longer read properly, made him sign papers that transferred all the shares to you. But my mother kept the real documents." Richard felt his blood run cold. William Silver. That was a name he hadn't heard in decades, and for good reason. When his former partner was suffering from vision problems caused by diabetes, Richard had taken advantage of the situation to become the sole owner of the company they had built together. At the time, William was a widower, and Richard believed there was no family to contest the transaction. "You're making this up," Richard said, but his voice trembled slightly. William Silver had no family. He was alone. He had a daughter. The boy opened the envelope and began spreading documents on the table. "My mother, Margaret Silver. She has worked in this building for 15 years, the janitor on the 15th floor." One of the foreign investors stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Richard, what is happening here? Can we reschedule this meeting?" "No," Richard replied too quickly, revealing his nervousness. "This is just a confused child. I'll call security right now." But when he reached for the phone, Nathan spoke again, and his words made Richard freeze mid-motion. "You know this deed, don't you?" The boy held a paper yellowed with age. "It's the true partnership certificate. It states that my grandfather owned 70% of the shares, and you only 30. But in the papers you forged, that appears reversed." Richard felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. How had that boy gotten those documents? He was sure he had destroyed all the original papers years ago, or at least he thought he had. Richard's secretary appeared at the door, breathless. "Mr. Richard, I'm sorry. I tried to stop him, but the boy said it was urgent and—" "Get out!" Richard shouted, more nervous than angry. Nathan seized the moment to continue spreading documents across the table. There were birth certificates, company registration proofs, even old photographs showing William Silver and Richard working together in what appeared to be a much simpler office than that luxurious room. "This photo was taken when you started the company," Nathan said, pointing to a black and white image. "My grandfather is holding the first contract you ever landed. My mother told me he stayed up 3 nights in a row to finish that project." Richard looked at the photograph and felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time: guilt. William really had been a tireless worker. He had brilliant ideas and a dedication that Richard secretly envied. When they started together, Richard contributed more of the initial money, while William brought the technical knowledge and creativity. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked, his voice now lower. "My mother never threw anything away," Nathan replied. She told me my grandfather always said that one day the truth would come out. He died when I was 5, but he left everything neatly organized in a box, even the letters you exchanged when you were friends." The word friends hit Richard like a punch to the gut. They really had been friends once. More than partners, they were like brothers. William had been the best man at Richard's wedding, and Richard had promised to take care of William when he grew old. Instead, he had taken advantage of his friend's illness to steal everything they had built together. One of the executives present at the meeting, a grey-haired man named Dr. Harold, approached the table to examine the documents. He was a lawyer and had worked with Richard for over 10 years, always believing his boss was an honest and successful businessman. "Richard," Dr. Harold said slowly, examining a certificate, "these documents appear to be authentic. The dates match. The stamps are correct. If this is true, then—" "Then nothing," Richard interrupted, but he knew he was losing control of the situation. "It's all a forgery. This boy and his so-called mother are trying to scam me." Nathan was not ruffled by the accusation. Instead, he pulled another paper from the envelope. "This is my grandfather's will. It was notarized 2 weeks before he died. It clearly states that all his shares in the company should pass to my mother, and then to me." Dr. Harold took the will and examined it carefully. His face grew increasingly serious as he read. "Richard, this is a legally valid will. If these documents are indeed authentic, your ownership of this company could be legally contested." The situation was slipping from Richard's control faster than he could keep up. The foreign investors began talking among themselves in English, clearly concerned by what they were witnessing. A multi-million-dollar deal was about to be signed, and now a legal issue had appeared that could complicate everything. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, "I want to speak to this boy's mother," Richard said, trying to regain some control. "I want to understand what she's trying to do." "She's at work," Nathan replied simply. "Her shift ends at 5 in the afternoon, but she knows I'm here. She's the one who told me to bring these papers." Richard looked at his watch. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. He needed time to think, to understand exactly what was happening and how he could resolve that situation. But the foreign investors were clearly bothered, and he couldn't lose that deal. "Son," he said, trying to sound calm, "how about we talk about this more calmly? I can speak with your mother after her shift, and the 3 of us can sort out this mess like civilized people." "It's not a mess," Nathan replied firmly. "It's justice. My grandfather worked hard to build this company, and you took everything from him when he was weak and sick. That's not right." The way the boy spoke impressed everyone present. It wasn't the tantrum of a spoiled child, but the determination of someone who truly believed they were doing the right thing. There was a maturity in his eyes that didn't match his 12 years of age. Dr. Harold approached Richard and whispered in his ear, "Richard, I think you'd better take this seriously. If these documents are real, you could be in serious legal trouble. Besides, the investors are getting nervous." Richard looked around the room. The 5 executives who moments ago were laughing at the situation now watched him with serious, concerned expressions. The papers scattered on the table seemed like irrefutable proof that his version of the story wasn't the only one that existed. "All right," he said finally, "let's postpone this meeting. I need to settle this matter first." The foreign investors didn't like the decision at all. They had flown in specifically to close that deal and now would have to return to their countries without a resolution. Richard knew he was risking losing millions, but he had no choice. After everyone left the room, Richard was alone with Nathan. The boy had put all the documents back in the envelope, but remained there, standing, as if waiting for something. "What do you want from me?" Richard asked, his voice now tired. "I want you to admit that you stole from my grandfather," Nathan answered, "and I want you to return what is rightfully ours." "And if I do that, will you and your mother go away and stop bothering me?" Nathan shook his head. "It's not just about money, it's about doing what's right. My grandfather was a good man who trusted you, and you betrayed that trust." Richard sat down heavily in his chair. How could a 12-year-old boy make him feel worse about himself than any adult ever had? There was something in the way Nathan spoke that reminded Richard of how William used to be. Direct, honest, without mincing words. "Your grandfather has been dead for years," Richard said, more to himself than to Nathan. "Why does it matter now?" "Because my mother cried every night for years," Nathan replied, his voice trembling slightly for the first time. "She told me how sad my grandfather was in the last months of his life, saying you had changed, that you had become greedy. He didn't understand how someone he considered a brother could do that to him." Richard felt a lump in his throat. William had indeed tried to talk to him about the papers, but Richard always changed the subject or made excuses not to discuss the business. At the time, he convinced himself he was just being smart, securing his financial future. He had never stopped to think about the emotional impact it would have on his friend. "Where is your mother now?" Richard asked. "Cleaning the bathrooms on the 15th floor?" Nathan answered. "Like she has every day for 15 years. She could be working as a secretary or assistant, but you never let any employee get promoted if they had the last name Silver." Richard was startled. How did the boy know that? It was true that he had instructed the Human Resources Department to never promote William's daughter, but he thought no one had noticed the pattern. "She got her accounting degree through correspondence courses," Nathan continued. "Studied at night while raising me alone, but she could never get out of cleaning. Whenever she applied for other positions here in the building, she was rejected without explanation." Richard didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he had instructed HR to never hire or promote Margaret for positions that could give her access to important company documents. He was afraid she would eventually discover the truth about what had happened to her father's shares. "I want to speak with her," Richard finally said. "You can speak," Nathan replied, "but she already knows you're going to try to offer us money to leave, and she has already decided she won't accept it." "How can you be so sure?" "Because my mother taught me that some things are more important than money. Dignity is one of them. Justice is another." Richard observed the boy with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Nathan had a determination that strongly reminded him of William's. It wasn't childish stubbornness, but a deep conviction that he was doing the right thing. Richard's phone rang. It was his secretary, informing him that Margaret Silver was asking to come up and speak with him. Richard authorized it, knowing the time had come to face the daughter of the man he had betrayed. 15 minutes later, the door opened and a woman of about 40 entered, wearing the company's blue cleaning uniform. She was tall and thin, with her hair tied in a simple ponytail and hands calloused from hard work. Her eyes, however, held the same determination Richard had seen in Nathan. "Good afternoon, Mr. Richard," she said, her voice polite but firm. "I'm Margaret Silver. I believe you've already met my son." Richard rose from his chair, trying to appear professional despite the unusual situation. "Mrs. Margaret, I apologize for this misunderstanding. Your son came here with some confusing stories about—" "They're not stories," Margaret interrupted him. "They're facts, and I have more documents at home that prove everything my son showed you today." Richard felt his stomach tighten. More documents? How was it possible that William had kept so much evidence? "Mrs. Margaret, let's be practical. If you truly believe you're entitled to something, we can resolve this in a civilized manner. I can offer a generous sum for you to— for me and my son to disappear." Margaret finished the sentence. "Is that what you're proposing?" Richard realized he had misspoken, but it was too late. Margaret stared at him with a look of contempt that made him feel even smaller than he already did. "That's not what I meant," he tried to explain. "That's exactly what you meant," she replied. "You want to buy us, like you've bought other people's consciences over these years. But neither I nor my son are for sale." Nathan moved closer to his mother and took her hand. Richard noticed how they supported each other, a real partnership between mother and son that impressed him and somehow saddened him. "What do you want then?" Richard asked. "We want you to admit what you did," Margaret answered, "publicly. And we want you to return what rightfully belongs to our family." "That's impossible. The company is worth hundreds of millions. I built this over decades." "You built it on a lie," Nathan interrupted. "Using my grandfather's ideas, the projects he created, the contracts he secured. You just put up the money at the beginning. It was my grandfather who made the company grow. Richard knew the boy wasn't completely wrong. William had truly been the creative brain of the partnership, while Richard had always been better with the financial side. But that didn't change the fact that he had turned a small company into a business empire. Even if I wanted to do that, Richard said, it would be impossible. I have minority shareholders, bank loans, international commitments. I can't just hand the company over to you. We don't want you to hand over the company, Margaret said, surprising Richard. We want you to acknowledge our legitimate stake. According to the original documents, our family is entitled to 70% of the shares. That doesn't mean we'll take over management immediately, but it means we'll have a right to the profits and the major decisions. Richard did the math mentally. 70% of the company's annual profits meant tens of millions of dollars. It would be financially devastating for him, but perhaps not impossible to manage. And if I accept this partnership, he said cautiously, will you keep it quiet? You won't go to the press? Margaret and Nathan exchanged looks. That depends on you, Margaret replied. If you are honest with us and keep your promises, we have no interest in creating scandals. But if you try to deceive us again, we'll tell everyone the truth, Nathan finished. Richard needed time to think. That situation was too complex to be resolved in one afternoon. There were legal, financial, and even personal implications he needed to consider. All right, he finally said. I'll review the documents with my lawyers. Can you give me a few days? We can, Margaret answered, but not too many days. My son missed classes today to come here. He can't keep missing school because of the problems you created. Richard nodded, impressed again by the priority the family gave to the boy's education. Even facing that tense situation, Margaret was worried about her son's studies. One last thing, Nathan said before leaving. You knew my grandfather. You know what kind of man he was. He didn't deserve what you did to him. Richard was left alone in the room after mother and son left. He sat back down in his chair and looked out the window, watching the city movement below. For the first time in years, he allowed his memories to return to the times when he worked side by side with William. They were young and full of dreams. William had revolutionary ideas for the engineering field, while Richard had the contacts and the money needed to turn those ideas into reality. They worked late, ate cold pizza in the makeshift office, dreamed about the future of the company they were building together. William was married at the time, and his wife, Mary, always welcomed Richard as a member of the family. When Mary died in a car accident, Richard was one of the few friends who stood by William during his grief. He helped take care of Margaret, who was a 15-year-old teenager at the time. How had everything changed so much? How had he become the kind of person capable of taking advantage of a friend's illness? Richard picked up the phone and called Dr. Harold. Harold, I need you to review some documents. It's about the company's founding. We may have a serious legal problem. After explaining the situation to his lawyer, Richard cancelled all his appointments for the rest of the week. He needed to understand exactly what his legal situation was and what his options were. That night, Richard arrived home later than usual. His wife Susan immediately noticed something was wrong. They had been married for 20 years but never had children. Richard had always been very focused on work, and Susan had grown accustomed to playing a secondary role in her husband's life. Did something happen at the company? Susan asked during dinner. Richard told his wife the whole story. She listened in silence, asking occasional questions to clarify some points. Richard, she said when he finished, did you really do that? Steal your partner's company when he was sick? Richard tried to justify himself, talking about business opportunities and strategic decisions, but the words sounded hollow even to him. You knew William, Susan said gently. He was a good man, and that girl Margaret was practically a daughter to us when she was a teenager. How could you do that to them? Richard had no answer. For all those years, he had managed to avoid thinking about the moral consequences of his actions. He focused only on the financial results, the company's growth, the success he had achieved. What are you going to do now? Susan asked. I don't know, Richard admitted. If I acknowledge their rights, I'll lose most of my fortune. But if I don't acknowledge them, they can sue me and I could lose everything anyway. Maybe the question isn't about what you're going to lose, Susan said, but about what's the right thing to do. Richard spent the entire night awake, thinking. For the first time in decades, he was being forced to confront the consequences of his past actions. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the financial success he had achieved was worth the guilt he was feeling. The next day, Richard arrived at the office determined to find a solution. But when he got to the building, he discovered the story had leaked. Some cleaning company employees had heard rumors about Margaret's conversation with the boss, and the news was spreading quickly. Richard found Dr. Harold already waiting in his office, with a stack of documents on the desk. "Richard, we have problems," the lawyer said without preamble. "I had some experts analyze the documents that boy brought. They are authentic. Not just authentic, but also legally valid." Richard sat down heavily in his chair. "What does that mean in practice?" "It means if this family decides to sue you, they have a very real chance of winning. And if they win, you won't just have to return the shares, but you might also have to pay compensation for the profits they missed out on all these years." Richard did quick calculations. Decades of lost profits could mean an astronomical sum of money, much more than he had available in bank accounts. "Is there any way to challenge the validity of the documents?" Dr. Harold shook his head. "Richard, I've worked with you for 10 years. I always believed you were an honest businessman, but these documents tell a very different story. If you have any hope of resolving this without losing everything, you need to negotiate with them in good faith." Richard knew his lawyer was right. He had made a serious mistake decades ago, and now the time had come to pay for it. "Schedule a meeting with them," Richard said. "Let's try to reach an agreement." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Richard spent the whole day nervous, rehearsing different proposals in his head. He had consulted his accountants and found he could offer a significant amount without going completely broke. But he knew the mother and son weren't interested only in money. Margaret arrived punctually, this time accompanied not only by Nathan, but also by a gentleman of approximately 70 years whom Richard did not know. "This is Mr. Charles?" Margaret said, introducing the man. "He worked with my father in the company's early years." Richard greeted Charles politely, but felt a knot in his stomach. Another witness to the old events was the last thing he needed. "Mr. Richard," Charles said, his voice calm but firm, "I was present when William signed the papers transferring the shares to you. I remember it perfectly because I found it very strange at the time." "Strange how?" Richard asked, though he suspected the answer. "William couldn't see properly because of his diabetes, but you insisted he sign without me or anyone else reading the documents to him. You said it was urgent, and there was no time for explanations." Richard felt as if the world were collapsing around him. Charles had been the company's accountant in the early years before retiring. His credibility as a witness would be irrefutable in any court. "William trusted you," Charles continued. "He believed you when you said they were just routine papers to formalize the partnership. It never crossed his mind that his best friend was stealing his entire life." The silence that followed was awkward. Richard did not know how to respond to the accusations, especially because they were true. "Mr. Richard," Margaret finally said, "we want to propose a fair solution for everyone." Richard perked up slightly. Perhaps there was a way out that wouldn't leave him completely ruined. "What kind of solution?" "First, you will publicly admit that you stole from my father," Margaret said. "You will publish a letter in the newspapers apologizing to our family and explaining what really happened." Richard felt his mouth go dry. A public confession would destroy his reputation forever. He would never be able to do business or maintain credibility in the market again. "Second," Nathan continued, "you will return the shares that belong to our family, 70%, as stated in the original documents. And third," Charles added, "you will pay compensation for the profits the family missed out on all these years." Richard did quick calculations. The 3 demands together would leave him not just poor, but possibly in debt. He would lose everything he had built over decades. "That's impossible," he said. "You're asking me to ruin myself completely." "You ruined my father," Margaret replied. "He died poor, sick and sad, thinking he had lost everything because of bad decisions. In truth, he lost everything because of the greed of someone he considered a brother." Richard felt tears burning his eyes. He had genuinely liked William. In the company's early years, they were inseparable. They worked together, dreamed together, planned the future together. How had everything gone so wrong? I can pay compensation," Richard said slowly. "I can transfer a portion of the shares, but to admit publicly, that will destroy my life." "Your life is already destroyed," Nathan said with a frightening maturity. "You destroyed it when you decided money was more important than friendship. Now you're just acknowledging it." Richard looked at the boy and saw an unshakable determination. Nathan wasn't doing this out of revenge or for money. He genuinely believed he was fighting for justice. And perhaps he was right. "I'll need time to organize the finances," Richard finally said. "Transferring shares isn't something that happens overnight." "How much time?" Margaret asked. "A month, maybe 2. "1 month," Margaret agreed. "But we want to see progress. Documents signed, schedules set. We won't wait indefinitely while you try to find a way to deceive us again." Richard nodded, knowing he had no choice. But as the meeting was coming to an end, a part of his mind was still searching for alternatives. Was there a way to resolve this without losing everything? Some legal loophole his lawyers could exploit. That night, Richard called an emergency meeting with all his legal advisors. He explained the situation in detail and asked them to find any possible way to challenge the Silver family's claims. "Richard," said Dr. Harold after hours of discussion, "you need to understand one thing. From a legal standpoint, they have a strong case. But from a moral standpoint, their case is even stronger. If this goes to court, you won't just lose the shares. Your reputation will be destroyed, and you might even face criminal charges for fraud." "Criminal charges?" Richard was alarmed. "Falsifying business documents is a crime, and we have a witness willing to say you deceived a sick man to steal his company. Any prosecutor would be happy to take a case like this forward." Richard realized he was truly cornered. There was no easy way out, no legal loophole that could save him. He would really have to face the consequences of his actions. But then one of his younger lawyers raised an interesting point. "Richard, you said the boy's mother has worked as a building custodian for 15 years. "Yes, why?" "Well, if she knew about the documents all this time, why did she wait 15 years to do anything? Why didn't she challenge the situation before?" Richard perked up. Perhaps there was a defense based on the elapsed time. "That's a good question," Dr. Harold admitted. "There might be some issue of statute of limitations or other time constraints we can use." Richard felt a little relieved. Maybe there was still a way out of this situation without losing everything. The next day, he asked Margaret to come to his office again. This time, he was accompanied by 3 lawyers. "Mrs. Margaret," Richard began, trying to sound confident, "my lawyers have raised an important question. Why did you wait 15 years to challenge the situation? If you truly believed you were entitled to the shares, why didn't you do anything before?" Margaret looked at the lawyers and then back at Richard. "Because I didn't know," she replied simply. "What do you mean you didn't know? Your father died years ago. Didn't you see his will before?" "I saw the will," Margaret explained, "but it only said I would inherit the company shares. I thought the shares he had were the ones you said he had." 30%. Richard was confused. If she didn't know about the 70%, how had she found out? "It was only last month that I discovered the truth," Margaret continued. "When I was organizing old documents to renew some insurance policies, I found the box my father had kept with all the original company papers." "And why did you decide to act now?" Margaret looked at Nathan, who was sitting silently beside her. "Because my son asked me why we work so hard and yet have so little. He said he didn't understand how his grandfather, who had founded a large company, had left the family in a difficult financial situation. That's when I started investigating and discovered that my father hadn't lost money. Someone had stolen from him." Richard realized the statute of limitations argument wouldn't work. If Margaret had only recently discovered the fraud, the time limit to challenge it would start from the discovery, not from the original date of the events. "There's something else," Margaret said, taking new documents from her bag. "I found the letters my father wrote to you in the last months of his life. He was trying to understand why he had lost control of the company. He even wrote asking for a meeting to discuss the papers he had signed." Richard vaguely remembered the letters. At the time, he had instructed his secretary to reply that he was too busy to meet. He never imagined William was suspecting anything. "One of these letters is particularly interesting," Margaret continued, handing a yellowed sheet to Dr. Harold. "In it, my father says he cannot remember signing papers transferring full control of the company. He was asking you to clarify what had happened." Dr. Harold read the letter in silence, his face growing more serious. "Richard," he whispered, "this letter is dated just 2 months before William's death. If he was questioning the transaction at that time, it suggests he had not fully understood what he was signing at the time." Richard felt the little hope he still had fading. Every document Margaret presented made his legal situation more precarious. "Mrs. Margaret," one of the other lawyers tried to argue, "even if these issues are true, you must understand that reversing a business situation after so many years is extremely complicated. There are other shareholders, bank loans, international contracts." "That is Mr. Richard's problem," Margaret replied calmly. "He created this situation when he decided to steal from my father. If it's complicated to fix now, he should have thought of that before." Nathan, who had remained silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "My mother doesn't want to destroy the company. She only wants what is rightfully ours. If necessary, we can find a way to resolve this gradually." Richard looked at the boy with surprise. It was the first time anyone from the family had suggested any kind of compromise or flexibility. "What do you mean by gradually?" "I mean that maybe you don't need to transfer all the shares at once," Nathan explained. "You can keep managing the company, but pay us our share of the profits. And you can transfer the shares little by little as you manage to reorganize the finances." Richard felt a little relieved. The boy's proposal didn't solve all his problems, but at least offered a way to avoid immediate financial ruin. "And what about the public confession?" Richard asked. "That is non-negotiable," Margaret said firmly. "You need to admit what you did. My father deserves for the truth to be known." Richard knew a public confession would destroy his reputation, but began to realize that perhaps this was the only way to resolve the situation without ending up completely ruined. "I need to speak with my accountants," he said finally. "See how much I can pay monthly without breaking the company." "You have 1 week," Margaret said. "We want to see a concrete proposal in 1 week." After mother and son left, Richard was alone with his lawyers. The silence in the room was heavy. "Richard," Dr. Harold finally said, "I think you should seriously consider accepting their proposal. It's the best offer you're going to get." "But a public confession. It will be bad for your reputation, but it won't be worse than a public trial where all these documents will be presented as evidence. At least this way you maintain some control over the narrative." Richard knew his lawyer was right. He had made a grave mistake in the past, and now he was being forced to face the consequences. The only question was whether he could do it in the least destructive way possible. That night, Richard told Susan about the new proposal. "They're being generous," Susan said, surprising her husband. "Generous? They want me to publicly admit that I'm a thief." "Richard, you are a thief," Susan said gently, "at least as far as this situation is concerned, and they could be demanding much more. The fact that they're willing to accept gradual payments means they care more about justice than revenge." Richard fell silent. His wife was right, but it was hard to accept the reality of his situation. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should accept their offer," Susan replied, "and take the opportunity to apologize, not just publicly, but personally too. You hurt people who cared about you. That's priceless." In the following days, Richard worked with his accountants to develop a financial proposal that was viable. He discovered he could pay the Silver family a significant monthly amount without bankrupting the company, provided he drastically reduced his own standard of living. He would have to sell his country house, trade his luxury car for a simpler model, cancel the annual international trips he took with Susan. It would be a drastic change, but it wouldn't be the complete ruin he had initially feared. The public confession, however, still terrified him. Richard spent entire nights awake, imagining what it would be like to face fellow businessmen, clients, and employees after admitting he had built his fortune on a lie. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. At the end of the week, Richard asked to meet with Margaret and Nathan again. This time he had prepared a detailed proposal, including payment schedules and plans for the gradual transfer of shares. "I can pay 15% of the company's annual profits to you starting immediately," Richard explained, "and I can transfer 10% of the shares each year until completing the 70% in 7 years. Margaret and Nathan analyzed the numbers in silence. "And the public confession?" Margaret asked. Richard took a deep breath before answering. "I will write a letter to the city's main newspapers. I will explain what happened and apologize to the family of William Silver." "When?" "Next Sunday. It will be published in the newspaper's opinion section." Nathan exchanged glances with his mother. "Mom, what do you think?" Margaret was thoughtful for a few moments. "Mr. Richard, I have an important question. Are you doing this because you feel remorse for what you did, or only because you were caught?" The question took Richard by surprise. He had spent so much time focused on the practical and financial aspects of the situation that he hadn't stopped to think about his true feelings. He began but stopped. He wanted to give an honest answer, not just a convenient one. "I feel remorse," Richard finally said. "William was my friend. He was like a brother to me, and I betrayed him in the worst way possible. All these years I tried not to think about it, but now that I'm forced to face what I did, yes, I deeply regret it." Margaret studied him for a few moments. "All right, we'll accept your proposal. But if you try to deceive us again, if you delay payments or don't keep your promises, we'll go straight to the authorities, and then there will be no more negotiation." Richard nodded, relieved and terrified at the same time. He had avoided complete ruin, but now he would have to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. The following Sunday, Richard's confession was published in the newspaper. The letter caused a sensation in the city. Some businessmen criticized him severely, others expressed surprise and disappointment. Important clients cancelled contracts, business partners re-evaluated their associations. Richard arrived at the office on Monday, expecting to find a hostile environment. Instead, he was greeted by Margaret, who was waiting at the reception desk. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," she said politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret. Is something wrong?" "Yes, I read your letter in the newspaper. I wanted to thank you for being honest about my father." Richard felt moved. It was the first time in days that someone had spoken to him without judgment or anger. "Margaret, I want you to know that I am deeply sorry for what I did. Your father was a good man, and he did not deserve to be treated that way." "I know," she replied, "and I accept your apology. Now we need to think about the future." "What do you mean?" "Well, if we are going to be partners, we need to learn to work together. Nathan suggested that I take on some administrative role in the company. After all, I have a degree in accounting and 15 years of experience working here." Richard was surprised by the proposal, but realized it made sense. If Margaret was going to become a majority shareholder, it was logical for her to be actively involved in management. "What kind of role do you have in mind?" "Initially, I would like to work in the finance department. I want to understand how the company works, what the costs, profits, and investments are. If I am going to own 70% of the shares, I need to know where my money is going." Richard felt a pang of nervousness. Having Margaret scrutinize the company's finances meant she would discover all the excessive spending, inflated salaries, and benefits he had granted himself over the years. "Of course," he said, trying to sound confident. "I can ask the finance department to prepare detailed reports." "Thank you. Oh, and one more thing, I want Nathan to have access to these reports as well. He is very smart and has interesting ideas about how a company should run." The idea of a 12-year-old boy examining his company's finances sounded absurd to Richard, but he was in no position to complain. "As you wish," he agreed. During the following weeks, a new dynamic was established in the company. Margaret began working part-time in the finance department, maintaining her janitorial duties the rest of the time. She refused to stop cleaning immediately, saying she needed a gradual transition. Nathan appeared at the company every afternoon after school, asking questions about reports and suggesting changes to processes. Richard was impressed by the boy's intelligence and his ability to identify inefficiencies that had gone unnoticed for years. "Mr. Richard," Nathan said one afternoon, "why does the company spend so much money on luxury cars for the executives?" Richard explained that expensive cars were important for the company's image, but Nathan didn't seem convinced. "My mother taught me that it's better to save money for important things than to spend it to impress other people. Maybe the company could use that money to give raises to the employees." The boy's observation made Richard reflect on many expenses he had considered normal and necessary. For the first time in years, he began to question whether he really needed all the luxuries he had accumulated. 3 months after the public confession, Richard had adapted to the new reality. His reputation had been shaken, but he found that many people respected his honesty in admitting the mistake. Some clients even returned to do business with the company, saying they preferred to work with someone who had learned from their errors. The most significant change, however, was in his relationship with work. For the first time in decades, Richard did not feel alone in managing the company. Margaret brought a practical and sensible perspective to decisions, while Nathan contributed creative ideas that often surprised the adults. "Mr. Richard," Margaret said during a monthly meeting, "I have a proposal to make." "What would that be?" "I would like to create a financial education program for the employees. Many of them don't know how to manage their salaries or plan for the future. If the company offered basic courses, everyone would benefit." Richard found the idea interesting but costly. "How much would that cost?" "Actually, I could teach the classes myself," Margaret explained. "I learned a lot about finances when I was studying accounting, and Nathan suggested we could use a company room after hours." "And what would the company gain from this?" "Financially educated employees are more productive and more loyal," Nathan answered. "They feel valued when the company invests in their education." Richard approved the program, and it became a great success. Employees who had never spoken directly with management began showing up to Margaret's classes, asking questions and suggesting improvements for the company. The relationship between Richard, Margaret, and Nathan continued to evolve. They weren't exactly friends, but they developed a professional partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. Richard discovered that Nathan had a natural talent for identifying problems and proposing solutions. The boy often asked questions that forced the adults to rethink processes that had become automatic. "Mr. Richard," Nathan asked one afternoon, "why doesn't the company hire more people from the local community?" "How so?" "Well, most employees come from distant neighborhoods and need to spend a lot of time and money on transportation. If we hired more people who live nearby, they would be more punctual and have more money to spend on other things." Richard had never thought of that, but the boy's logic made sense. They implemented a policy of preference for local candidates, which resulted in reduced absenteeism and increased productivity. 6 months after the public confession, Richard received an unexpected call. It was a journalist interested in writing a story about business people who learned from their mistakes. "Mr. Richard, your story has caused a lot of discussion in the business community. Some people criticized you, others praised you for your honesty. How do you feel about all this?" Richard thought for a few moments before answering. "I feel like someone who has finally stopped running from his responsibilities. For years, I built my life on a lie. Now I am learning to live with the truth, and discovering it is much more satisfying than I imagined." "Do you regret making the public confession?" "No. It was the most difficult decision I have ever made, but also the most important. My former partner, William Silver, was a good man who deserved to have his story told correctly." "And how is your relationship with the Silver family now?" "We are business partners. Margaret brought a very valuable perspective to the company, and Nathan, well, he is probably the smartest person I have ever met. I am learning a lot from them." The article was published a few days later and generated a positive response from the community. Many people commented that they respected Richard for facing his responsibilities instead of trying to run from them. The company also began receiving partnership proposals from social organizations interested in replicating the financial education program Margaret had created. "Mom," Nathan said one afternoon, "I think we could expand the program. Teach financial education to other companies in the region." "That would be a good idea," Margaret agreed. "But we would need more people to teach the classes. I know some people who could help," Richard said, surprising mother and son. Business colleagues who would also like to contribute to the community's education. And so the Silver Morrison Institute of Financial Education was born, a non-profit organization that offered free courses for workers from across the region. Richard discovered that using his network of business contacts for social purposes was far more rewarding than using it just to make more money. 1 year after the public confession, the company was more prosperous than ever. The employees were more productive, costs had been reduced thanks to Nathan's suggestions, and the company's reputation had recovered due to the social work they were developing. Richard, however, faced a difficult decision. Margaret had become such a competent manager that many employees suggested she should take over the presidency of the company. She understood the operations better than Richard, had the workers' trust, and demonstrated a sense of social responsibility that impressed clients and partners. "Margaret," Richard said during a private meeting, "I have a proposal to make." "What would that be?" "I would like you to assume the presidency of the company. You understand how it works better than I do, and the employees trust you in a way they never trusted me." Margaret was surprised by the proposal. "Mr. Richard, that wasn't part of our agreement. You don't need to give up management." "It's not about the agreement," Richard explained. "It's about doing what's best for the company. I built this company on a foundation of selfishness and greed. You can rebuild it on a foundation of cooperation and social responsibility." "And what would you do?" "I would like to focus on the Institute. I've discovered I have more of a calling for social work than for business management." Margaret considered the proposal for a few days before accepting. Nathan, now 13 years old, enthusiastically supported his mother's decision. "Mom, you're going to be the best president this company has ever had," he said, "and you'll show everyone that honest people can succeed in business." The transition of power was smooth. Richard retained a small stake in the company and continued as a consultant, but operational control passed completely to Margaret. She implemented changes that made the company even more efficient and socially responsible. Nathan continued visiting the company after school, but now he also became more actively involved in the Institute. He had developed a passion for education and planned to study pedagogy when he was older. "Mr. Richard," Nathan said one afternoon, while they were organizing teaching materials, "can I ask a personal question?" "Of course." "Are you happier now than you were before?" Richard thought about the question. He had much less money, a tarnished reputation, and had lost control of the company he built. But he also had a clear conscience, genuine relationships, and a life purpose that went beyond financial profit. "Yes," he answered sincerely, "I am much happier now." "Why?" "Because now I sleep well at night. For years I lived in fear that someone would discover what I had done. That fear consumed me, even when I tried to ignore it. Now that the truth has come out, I feel free." Nathan nodded, showing an understanding that impressed Richard. "My mother always says that lies are like debts. The longer you take to pay them, the more expensive they get." The boy's observation made Richard reflect on all the little lies and omissions he had accumulated over his life. The fraud against William had been just the biggest one, but there were many others. Small dishonesties that, together, had shaped his personality in a way he didn't like. "Nathan," Richard said, "when you grow up, what kind of person do you want to be?" The boy thought for a few moments. "I want to be like my grandfather. My mother always tells me he was a man who kept his word, who treated everyone with respect, and who never did anything that could harm other people. Those are admirable qualities, and I want to use what I've learned about business to help other families who have gone through situations similar to ours. I've found there are many people who have been deceived by partners or business associates. Richard felt inspired by the boy's determination. Nathan had transformed a traumatic experience into motivation to help others, instead of letting himself be consumed by anger or a desire for revenge. 2 years after the public confession, Richard received an unexpected invitation. Nathan was graduating from middle school and had chosen Richard as one of the people he wanted to thank in his graduation speech. "Mr. Richard," Nathan said during the ceremony, "when I was little, I thought the world was divided between good people and bad people, but I learned that life is more complicated. There are good people who do bad things, and there are people who make mistakes but have the courage to fix them. Mr. Richard taught me that it's never too late to do the right thing, even when it's difficult and costly." Richard was moved by the boy's words. During all those years of partnership, he had learned as much from Nathan as the boy had learned from him. After the ceremony, Margaret approached Richard. "Thank you," she said simply. "Why?" "For giving my son a chance to learn about business and about life. He has grown so much during these 2 years, and part of that is because of the time he spent working with you at the Institute." Richard felt gratified. Even though they had started as victims of his actions, the Silver family had become an important part of his life. "Margaret, may I ask a question? Have you completely forgiven me for what I did to your father?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once," she replied. "It's a process. Every time you keep a promise, every time you help someone at the Institute, every time you treat my employees with respect, it's a step in that process. I can say I no longer feel anger, and I can say I respect the man you have become, even if I don't agree with the man you were." Margaret's answer touched Richard deeply. He understood that forgiveness, like trust, was something that needed to be earned through consistent actions over time. 3 years after the public confession, the Silver Morrison Institute had become a regional reference in financial education. They had helped hundreds of families organize their finances, pay off debts, and plan for the future. Richard discovered that his true talent wasn't in managing companies, but in connecting people and resources to solve social problems. He used his business experience and his network of contacts to secure donations, partnerships, and volunteers for the Institute. Nathan, now 15, had become one of the Institute's most requested speakers. His personal story and his ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms made him a natural communicator. "Mr. Richard," Nathan said during a planning meeting, "I have an idea to expand our work." "What would that be?" "What if we started offering free consulting for small business owners? Many people have good business ideas, but don't know how to put them into practice in an honest and sustainable way." Richard thought the idea was excellent. They spent the following months developing a business mentorship program that combined technical knowledge with ethical principles. The program was launched on the 4th anniversary of Richard's public confession. During the launch ceremony, he was invited to give a speech about his journey of redemption. "4 years ago, I was a man rich in money but poor in character," Richard told the audience. "I had built my success on the betrayal of a friend and lived in constant fear that my dishonesty would be discovered. Today, I have much less money, but much more peace of mind. I learned that true success is not measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute." After the speech, many people approached to congratulate Richard on his transformation. Some were business owners interested in contributing to the Institute. Others were people who had been through similar situations and were seeking inspiration. An elderly woman stood out in the line of well-wishers. When it was her turn, she held Richard's hands and said, "My husband was deceived by a business partner 10 years ago. We lost everything, and he never recovered emotionally. Seeing your story gives me hope that not all business owners are dishonest." Richard felt moved and humbled at the same time. He realized that his public confession had not only affected his own life, but had also given hope to other people who had been victims of business fraud. That evening, Richard dined with Margaret, Nathan, and Susan. It was a tradition they had established. Whenever the Institute reached an important milestone, they would gather to celebrate and plan the next steps. "Mr. Richard," Susan said during dessert, I am proud of the man you have become. I am proud too, Nathan added. When I was little, I thought you were a bad person, but I learned that people can change when they really want to. And when they have help from good people, Richard replied, looking at Margaret. If you hadn't been so generous in giving me a second chance, I probably would have become bitter and defensive. Instead, you showed me a better path. Margaret smiled. My father always said that revenge is a luxury poor people cannot afford. We weren't rich enough to waste energy on anger. It was better to focus on building something positive. William's wisdom, passed down through his daughter, had not only shaped the family's response to the betrayal, but had also deeply influenced Richard's transformation. 5 years after the public confession, Richard received a phone call that would once again change the course of his life. It was a lawyer representing a major international foundation interested in replicating the Silver Morrison Institute model in other countries. Mr. Richard, the lawyer explained, our foundation has been impressed with the social impact you have managed to generate. We would like to propose a partnership to expand the program internationally. The proposal was tempting, but Richard knew he could not make this decision alone. I will discuss it with my partners and get back to you, he replied. That afternoon, Richard met with Margaret and Nathan to discuss the offer. It's an incredible opportunity, Margaret said. We could help many more people. But it would also be much more responsibility, Nathan observed, and we would have to travel a lot, which would mean less time here in the local community. Richard admired the young man's maturity, now 16 years old. Nathan had learned to consider not only the opportunities, but also the costs of each decision. What do you think we should do? Richard asked. I think we should accept, Margaret said, after a few moments of reflection, but with conditions. We want to keep our focus on the local community, so international expansion would have to be gradual and sustainable. And we want to ensure the Institute's values aren't lost during the expansion, Nathan added. Honesty, transparency, and social responsibility must be maintained everywhere the program is implemented. Richard smiled. The Silver family had once again demonstrated the wisdom that characterized them, ambitious enough to think big, but careful enough not to lose their roots. They accepted the partnership with the International Foundation, but established a conservative timeline that would allow sustainable growth without compromising the quality of the work. During the following 2 years, the Silver Morrison Institute expanded to 5 Latin American countries. Richard became a sort of ambassador for the program, traveling to implement new centers and train local teams. Nathan, even though still a minor, became a recognized figure in the international financial education movement. His personal story and his ability to communicate complex concepts in an accessible way made him a sought-after speaker at academic and business conferences. Mr. Richard, Nathan said during a trip to Mexico to inaugurate a new center, sometimes I think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't confessed what you had done. How would it be? We'd probably still be fighting in court to this day. My mother and I would be bitter and focused only on getting the money back. You would be on the defensive, trying to protect your lie, and none of us would be helping other people. Richard reflected on the young man's words. The public confession had been painful, but it had paved the way for something much greater than any of them had imagined. You're right, Richard agreed. The truth freed us to do things that would never have been possible if we were living a lie. When Nathan turned 18, he surprised everyone with an unexpected decision. Instead of accepting a full scholarship to a prestigious university, he chose to study pedagogy at a local college, so he could continue working at the institute while getting his degree. Nathan, Richard said, you have the potential to do anything. Why limit your options? I'm not limiting, Nathan replied. I'm focusing. I've discovered that my calling is to teach and help people build financially stable lives. That's what I want to do for the rest of my life. Nathan's decision inspired Richard to reflect on his own life purpose. He realized he had found more satisfaction in the last 7 years working at the Institute than in all his decades as a businessman. 7 years after the public confession, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold his remaining stake in the company and donated all the money to the Silver Morrison Institute. Richard, are you sure about this? Susan asked. "It's your entire fortune." "Actually," Richard replied, "my true fortune is the relationships I've built and the positive impact I've managed to create. Money sitting in a bank doesn't change anyone's life." The donation allowed the Institute to significantly expand its operations, creating specialized programs for young entrepreneurs, single mothers, and senior citizens. Richard, now 60 years old, dedicated himself fully to social work. He had found a life purpose that went far beyond personal financial success. During an international conference on financial education, Richard was invited to participate in a panel on redemption and ethical leadership. Other participants included businessmen who had overcome scandals and moral crises. "Mr. Richard," a young entrepreneur in the audience asked, "what was the most difficult moment of your redemption journey?" Richard thought for a few moments. "The most difficult moment wasn't making the public confession," he answered. "It was the first day I woke up knowing I had to live with the consequences of my actions for the rest of my life. There was no more running away or pretending. It was terrifying, but also liberating." "And what was the most rewarding moment?" Richard smiled before answering. "It was the day Nathan told me he no longer saw me as the person who had harmed his family, but as someone who had become part of the family. I realized I had managed to transform a relationship based on pain into one based on mutual respect and affection." After the conference, Richard received dozens of messages from entrepreneurs who were facing similar ethical dilemmas. Some had made mistakes in the past and didn't know how to deal with the guilt. Others were being tempted to take dishonest shortcuts and were looking for inspiration to make the right choice. Richard began corresponding regularly with these people, offering advice based on his own experience. He discovered that his story of downfall and redemption resonated with many people struggling with similar issues. 8 years after the public confession, Nathan graduated in pedagogy and officially assumed the educational directorship of the Institute. Margaret had become a respected entrepreneur, expanding the original company into new markets, always with a focus on social responsibility. Richard, now considered an expert in business ethics, was invited to teach at a local business school. His course was called Leadership and Social Responsibility and always had a waiting list. "Professor Richard," a student asked during a class, "do you think dishonest entrepreneurs can really change, or is their transformation a rare case?" Richard considered the question carefully. "I think anyone can change if they truly want to," he replied. "But true change requires 3 things. First, you have to fully admit what you did wrong, without excuses or justifications. Second, you have to be willing to pay the price for your actions, even if it's high. And third, you need to find a way to use your experience to help other people. And if the person can't do these 3 things, then they might even stop doing wrong things, but they probably won't manage to do truly right things. The difference between simply stopping being bad and actually becoming good is enormous." Richard's classes were popular not only because he was a good teacher, but because his personal story gave credibility to the lessons he taught. Students knew he wasn't just repeating theories, but sharing knowledge gained through painful experience and genuine transformation. 9 years after the public confession, the Silver Morrison Institute had become an international organization recognized by the UN as a model for community financial education. Richard, Margaret, and Nathan were invited to present their work at the United Nations General Assembly. "It's incredible to think how far we've come," Margaret commented as they prepared for the presentation. "When Nathan walked into that meeting room 9 years ago, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Neither did I," Richard admitted. "At the time, I just wanted you to leave and let me be. Now I can't imagine my life without the work we do together." "The most important thing is that thousands of families have been helped," Nathan observed. "What happened to us individually is less important than the impact we've managed to generate." The UN presentation was a success. Delegates from various countries expressed interest in implementing similar programs in their communities. The Silver Morrison model was being recognized as an effective way to combat poverty through financial education. After the presentation, Richard received a proposal to write a book about his experience. The publisher believed his redemption story could inspire other entrepreneurs to adopt more ethical practices. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to write about ethics," Richard said to Margaret and Nathan. "After all, I made a very serious mistake." "That's exactly why you are the right person," Nathan replied. "Who better to talk about the dangers of dishonesty than someone who has experienced those consequences firsthand?" Richard decided to write the book, but with one condition: all royalties would be donated to the Institute. He didn't want to make money telling his redemption story. He wanted the story to keep generating benefits for other people. The book, titled The Confession: How Honesty Transformed My Life and Business, became an international bestseller. Richard spent months traveling the world promoting the book and speaking about business ethics. During one of these trips, Richard received a call that moved him deeply. It was an Italian businessman who had read the book and decided to confess a fraud he had committed against his minority shareholders. "Your story gave me the courage to do the right thing," the man said. "I know it will be painful, but I can't live with this lie any longer." Richard offered to help the businessman navigate the process of confession and redemption based on his own experience. This was the first of many similar cases that Richard began to follow. 10 years after the original public confession, Richard had become a sort of informal counselor for repentant entrepreneurs around the world. He offered free guidance to anyone who wanted to confess past mistakes and work to make amends. "Richard," Susan said one night during dinner, "have you ever stopped to think about how your life has completely changed?" Richard looked around the table. They were having dinner in the simple house they had bought after selling the mansion. Margaret and Nathan were frequent guests, as were several other collaborators from the Institute. The house was always full of people engaged in conversations about social projects and ways to help the community. "It has completely changed," Richard agreed. 10 years ago I dined alone at a huge table, worried only about my own problems. Today I share meals with people who truly care about each other, discussing ways to solve other people's problems." "Which life do you prefer?" Richard did not hesitate to answer. "This one, without a doubt. The life I had before was luxurious but empty. This life has meaning." Nathan, now 22 and a graduate in education, had become the executive director of the Institute. His young and innovative leadership was taking the organization to new heights. "Mr. Richard," Nathan said, "I have a proposal to make." "What would that be?" "I would like to create a specific program for the children of business owners. Often, children grow up seeing questionable practices from their parents and end up repeating the same mistakes. If we could educate them early about business ethics, we could prevent many future problems." Richard completed the thought. "It's a brilliant idea." The program was implemented 6 months later and quickly gained support from business families who wanted to ensure their children grew up with solid values. Richard became a sort of father figure for many of the young participants in the program. His story served as a warning about the dangers of dishonesty, but also as inspiration about the possibility of redemption. "Professor Richard," a 16-year-old boy asked during a session, "how can I be sure I'll never make the same mistakes my father made?" Richard thought carefully before answering. "You can't be sure," he said honestly. "The temptation to take shortcuts will always exist, especially when you're under pressure. But you can create support systems to help you make the right choices, have friends who question you when you're making dubious decisions, establish clear principles and put them in writing, and always remember that every small choice shapes who you become." 15 years after the public confession, Richard celebrated his 70th birthday, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed through the work of the Silver Morrison Institute. The party was organized by Nathan and Margaret, who wanted to show Richard the lasting impact of his personal transformation. "Mr. Richard," Nathan said during his birthday speech, "when I was 12, I thought you were my enemy. Today, 15 years later, I consider you one of the most important men in my life, not for what you were, but for what you chose to become." Richard was moved by the words of the young man who had become like a son to him. "Nathan," he replied, "you and your mother gave me the greatest gift one person can give another, the opportunity for redemption. You could have chosen revenge or bitterness, but you chose to give me a chance to become a better person. I am eternally grateful for that. The party continued late into the night, with people sharing stories about how the Institute had changed their lives. Richard realized that his public confession, which had been the most terrifying moment of his life, had become the seed of something much larger and more meaningful than any business success he had previously achieved. In the following years, Richard continued working at the Institute, now focused mainly on mentoring young entrepreneurs and advising people seeking redemption for past mistakes. His physical energy had diminished with age, but his passion for social work remained intact. Nathan had married and had 2 small children, but remained dedicated to the Institute. He often brought his children to the office, saying he wanted them to grow up seeing examples of work that truly matters. "Grandpa Richard," one of the children said one day. Nathan had suggested his children call Richard Grandpa, even though they weren't blood relatives. "Why do you work so hard to help people you don't even know?" Richard smiled at the 5-year-old girl. "Because once in my life I did something very wrong and good people helped me fix it. Now it's my turn to help other people fix the wrong things they've done." "And does it work?" "Sometimes it works, and sometimes it's hard, but it's always worth trying." The simplicity of the child's question made Richard reflect on how many lives had been positively touched by his decision to confess his fraud and work to repair it. He had received letters from hundreds of people around the world who were inspired by his story to make positive changes in their own lives. 20 years after the public confession, Richard was at his home reviewing manuscripts for a new book when he received a call from Nathan. "Mr. Richard, I have some news," Nathan said, his voice full of emotion. "What happened?" "The Institute has just been selected to receive the International Social Impact Award. It's the highest recognition an organization like ours can receive." Richard felt proud, but not surprised. The work they had developed over 2 decades had truly transformed entire communities. "This is wonderful, Nathan. You all deserve full recognition. Mr. Richard, the award is for all of us. You are one of the founders of the Institute. Your personal transformation was what made all this possible." Richard was moved. 20 years ago, he was a wealthy but morally bankrupt man. Today, he was a person of modest financial means, but rich in meaningful relationships and positive social impact. "Nathan," Richard said, "I can say these were the 20 best years of my life." "The best years are still to come," Nathan replied. "We have so much important work ahead." Richard smiled. At 75, he still had the energy and passion to continue helping others. Redemption was not a destination one reaches, but a journey one lives every day. That evening, Richard sat on his porch with Susan, watching the stars and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with the most difficult confession of his life. "Richard," Susan said, "do you have any regrets about the choice you made 20 years ago?" Richard thought for a few moments. "I have regret about the original fraud," he answered. "I will always regret betraying William's trust, but I have no regret about having confessed and worked to repair the damage. That was the best decision I ever made." "Even knowing all the suffering you went through in the early years, especially because of the suffering, it was through the pain that I learned the true value of integrity. If I hadn't gone through that experience, I would probably still be the same selfish and dishonest person I was before." Susan held her husband's hand. "I am proud of the man you have become." Richard squeezed his wife's hand, grateful to have someone who had witnessed his entire journey of transformation and chosen to stay by his side during the most difficult times. As he watched the stars, Richard thought of all the people who had been part of his redemption. Margaret, who had chosen partnership over revenge, Nathan, who had transformed family pain into a life mission, Susan, who had remained by his side through the storm, Dr. Harold and other colleagues who had helped him navigate the legal and ethical complexities of his situation. Each of these people had contributed to his transformation in different ways, but all had been essential. Richard understood that redemption is not something a person achieves alone, but something that happens through the generosity and wisdom of a community. At 80, Richard still worked a few hours a week at the Institute, now mainly as a strategic advisor. Nathan had become an internationally respected leader in the field of financial education, and Margaret had expanded the family business to become one of the region's leading employers, always maintaining a focus on social responsibility. Richard spent his final years writing his complete memoirs, documenting not only his fall and redemption, but also the lessons he had learned about ethical leadership, social responsibility, and the importance of community in personal transformation. The memoir, titled 20 Years of Redemption, Lessons from a Rebuilt Life, became required reading in several business schools around the world. Richard did not live to see the book's full impact, but his words continued to inspire new generations of business leaders long after his passing. During Richard's funeral, Nathan gave a speech that perfectly summarized the legacy of the man who had transformed his own downfall into a platform to lift others up. "Richard Morrison began his adult life as my enemy," Nathan said, "but he ended it as my mentor, my inspiration, and my chosen family. He proved that it is never too late to change, that it is never too late to do the right thing, and that a life can be completely transformed through honesty, hard work, and dedication to the common good." His greatest legacy is not the millions he made as a businessman, but the thousands of lives that were positively touched by his transformation. He taught us that true success is not measured by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute. The Silver Morrison Institute continued to thrive after Richard's death, expanding its programs and touching even more lives. The story of its founding, a confrontation between a harmed family and the man who had harmed them, transformed into a partnership dedicated to social good, continued to inspire people around the world. The meeting room where it had all begun, where a 12-year-old boy had faced a powerful millionaire armed only with truth and determination, was turned into a memorial. A plaque on the wall tells the summarized story, how a child's courage and his mother's wisdom had given a fallen man the chance for redemption, and how he had seized that chance to build something greater than any personal fortune. The final entry in Richard's personal journal, found after his death, simply stated, "The truth sets us free not only from the consequences of our lies, but also from the limitations of who we thought we were. When we stop protecting our false image, we discover who we can truly become." End of story. This story shows us how a moment of courage can completely transform the course of a life. Now tell us, do you believe Richard made the right choice by confessing his mistake? Have you ever been in a situation where it was difficult to do the right thing? Share your opinion in the comments. We really want to read your sincere reflections on this journey of redemption. Don't forget to leave your like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss other moving stories that bring important lessons about character and personal transformation.